What is worth giving your life for? You ever think much about that? Actually, I think we might be surprised. If you're parents, you obviously would give your life for your children, wouldn't you? And who knows? Any given day, you might end up giving your life over for a complete stranger. This summer, there was a West Point cadet who was caught out in the undertow of the water along with someone else. The other one was drowning. He swam over to that person, kept this person above water as he himself was tiring out. And the help came, and that person was saved, but he gave his life for that person he didn't even know. So, there are things worth giving our lives for, and that tells us something about our mortal life, that it's not ultimate. And so, what is? What is ultimate? Well, I'm going to say something that's really radical for our culture, even offensive. I think the scriptures suggest for us tonight that we should give our lives over to God and for ultimate truth. Yes, absolute truth. Now, let us begin with the mother and the 7 sons. The whole story wasn't read, and it's probably just as well because it is gruesome. You can read it when you go home. But the context of this is Antiochus IV, a Greek king who had power over Israel at the time. He called himself Epiphanes, the word we get epiphany from, the appearance. He considered himself a god appearance, Zeus, in fact. And it was his business, this is his vision for Israel, that he would Hellenize Israel, which is the same thing as making it pagan. Did you know that paganism is an ancient form of relativism? Yes, because they believed in many gods. And if you have many gods, you have many truths. And if you have many truths, there really is no truth, is there? Now, in contrast to this, we have Judaism, where you have one transcendent God who reveals his will to us as absolute truth, moral absolutes. And so, this woman, this mother in Israel, she watched her sons, one by one, oldest to the youngest, die a terrible and painful death. And she was coaching them as this was happening, that they would stand firm. Now, we might ask, was this mother crazy? After all Antiochus was asking was that they would eat some swine flesh. No, she wasn't crazy because she was related to absolute truth. Verse 6 is what is said. The Lord is God is watching over us, and in truth has compassion on us, as Moses declared in his song, which bore witness against the people to their faces, when he said, and he will have compassion on his servants. In this situation where there was no compassion, she saw God in his compassion. She was related to God. She was related to absolute truth. And therefore, she was willing for her sons to die for it as well as herself. Now, from here, let's go to the gospel reading. We have the Sadducees. Who were the Sadducees? There's a funny little joke. They didn't believe in the resurrection. That's why they were sad, you see. That's an old Baptist saying, okay? But no, who are they? They were the religious and social elite of their time. They were keepers of the temple, upholders of the status quo. Now, we don't know them so much for what they did believe, but for what they did not believe. They didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They did not believe that there was going to be a final judgment. Sure, they worshiped the transcendent God of Israel, and they believed in the first 5 books of the Bible, but their God was not transcendent over death, at least over death for them. And when you think about it, if there's no final judgment, could they even speak of moral absolutes? Could they even believe in absolutes, truth? You see, the Sadducees were first century Jewish relativists. They were not truth seekers, but rooted in their own privileged position. Perhaps they would die for their privileged position, but they would not die for absolute truth. And Jesus' answer redirects them to absolute truth, to God, a God that transcends death, a God who is powerful to bring to life the dead. That is an absolute truth worth living for and dying for. Now, in 1535, it was a bad year for the church, because it was that year that Thomas More was martyred. You may have heard of him. Henry VIII wanted an annulment. You know the story, right? So, the church didn't give it to him. And so he decided to make his own church and make himself the authority of the church. And he wanted Thomas More to fall in line with this. He refused and gave up his position as a chancellor and said, okay, I can't serve you this way. But that wasn't good enough. He had a sign saying he agreed with that he was the absolute truth. This is the beginning of secularization in the West. From that moment on, England became the seedbed for relativism. As a matter of fact, the patron saints of the Enlightenment were all English. We go from Bacon to Locke, Berkeley, Hume. And from England, it went to France, where it became, by Voltaire, the rage of Europe, the French propagandists. And finally, it went to Germany with all the Germans, what they like to do, systemize things like Kant. They systemized the Enlightenment. A war was waged against absolutes. And the only absolute is that there are no absolutes. And this is a contradiction that our culture is willing to live with. I think of the poem by Wallace Stevens in the 1930s. It was called The Man with the Blue Guitar. You may have heard of it, right? Things are as I think they are and say they are on my blue guitar. That's where we are today. Transcendent God and moral absolutes are not real. We live in an age of decadence, of sensual gratification, of violence, of abortion, of euthanasia. All of this comes out of relativism. You know, that's why I became a Catholic. I was a Protestant. Maybe you cradle Catholics don't really appreciate this, but it's chaos out there. And to come to the Roman Catholic Church that had catechism. You can open a catechism and say, yeah, this is what we believe. That's an amazing thing. We have a magisterium. We have truth. You know, the Catholic Church is the only, I don't want to call it institution, it's the bride of Christ, but is the only institution in the Western world that stood up against relativism. That's why the social engineers, and that's why the cultural forces are marshaled up against the church. Well, in conclusion, what's worth giving our lives for? What a joy it is to believe that there is something like truth, absolute truth, and we can give our lives over to it. And ultimately, truth is a person, Jesus Christ. And the closer we get to Jesus, the closer we get to truth. Now, I hear Catholics who say, well, one's truth is like another's truth. So many in the church are being seduced by relativism. Be a truth seeker. Have something to live and die for.